Vic Reeves, Me Moir, Volume 1, 0-20. Written and read by Vic Reeves. By all accounts, I was ejected from the warmth and safety of Mum's womanhood at 11:55 p.m, just short of my due time. Had I been expelled 5 minutes later, I would have been born on the 25th of January, the same day as my father and grandfather. I've always told people that I have the same birthday as my dad and Grampy, a little white lie that makes a good story and injures no one, a maxim I've always employed and to good measure. But the truth is that I was born James Roderick Moir in St Jimmy's Hospital, Leeds, on the 24th of January, 1959. I was 8 pounds when I was born, healthy and of good cheer, yet the midwife suggested that it might be a good idea for Mum to feed me on Complan, the weight-gaining food supplement. This she did, and I became so corpulent so quickly that my mother was unable to pluck me from my cot, and I was eventually prized out with an oar. A skip was later rented to accommodate my ever-increasing mass. I presume that the midwife's medical advice was commonplace in the late 1950s. Indeed, scientific records confirmed that the Earth's axis shifted an amazing 12 inches under the strain of a Britain weighed down with millions of colossal babies. Not before time, the government came to the rescue and banned the infant Complan diet before the UK could sink into the briny deep. It was replaced by a regime of boiled sprouts and dried egg, mashed into a glutinous soup and administered with wooden spoons. The baby weight problem quickly vanished, but was soon replaced by a fresh hell in the form of deadly gases permeating the land. As a child, I was known as Rod. This was because all the men in our family were first named James. My grandfather was James Gatherer Smith Moir, and he took the Jim moniker, being first in line. My dad was James Neil Moir, and he was known as Neil. This led to all manner of confusion with official letters and the like, especially when I began school and had to explain to the teachers why I wanted to be called a name other than the one clearly printed on the register. I eventually became Jim when I began work, but that was still a long time off. James Neil Moir was a linotype operator at the Yorkshire Post. His father and his father's father were also printers, and as far back as can be traced in the east coast of Scotland, where my dad's side sprang from, the Moyers were all involved in the paper industry. He was a good man in every sense of the word. He worked hard and saved up enough money to have his own bungalow built in the up-and-coming Adel area of Leeds. Prior to that, he and my mum had lived in a grotty one-bedroom flat next to a graveyard in Primley Park Road, the sound of screech owls keeping them awake at night. But they had a strong love for one another and shared aspirations for a life improved. I was installed into 20 new adult gardens and the cot which Dad had made in the garage. He made the cot in the garage. I wasn't living in the garage, and it was painted white and embossed with a pale blue moulded lamb, which I immediately took umbrage to, screaming for mercy. I took umbrage equally at the sight of my father. As he rose over me and coochie-cooed at his freshly born son, I was alarmed by the hairy protuberance on his face. And as if the moustache wasn't bad enough, his spectacles filled me with even greater dread. I panicked and unleashed a banshee cry that awoke and unnerved not only the city of Leeds and all of Yorkshire but parts of Lancashire as well. In the days that followed, I grew to understand Dad's whiskers and specs, and in further weeks actually came to love them. The incident was not, however, my only brush with fear. In fact, my earliest memory is one of sheer, unqualified terror. One that, once again, led to a bout of uncontrollable wailing. Where we lived, there was a ginnel, which, to you heathens who are not from the north, is a thin passageway between buildings. Anyway, this particular ginnel led from the end of our cul-de-sac to the shops on the main road. Mum pushed me there in my pram, the type that can only be described as a Thames barge with cartwheels attached, beneath a hood the size of a bus shelter. Propelling this titanic brute must have taken a gargantuan effort on the part of my mother. She being a mere 5'1" tall, a gust of wind regularly sent her into orbit, and she was often captured on radar by air traffic control. On the day currently under consideration, we somehow arrived at the shops without taking to the air, and she parked me outside a shop and went in to buy groceries, a practice which would rarely be undertaken nowadays, but then was commonplace. At that moment, I recall looking up out of my pram and seeing a corrugated fence to my right. This alarmed me to the point of inducing another shrieking fit, and even though I was probably only a couple of months old when the corrugated fence incident took place, I can remember it like it was yesterday. When I was 1 year old, Mum left Dad in charge of me while she went off shopping. It was the first time my dad had been allowed to look after me, and he was brimming with confidence, a confidence that would be shattered by the end of the day. It was a beautiful morning, and we played in the garden, me on my new horse-headed tricycle, my dad prompting me to turn in circles until he eventually corralled me into the delphiniums. What fun we had! However, tired by our exertions, it was soon time to go back indoors for some lunch. On the way back, I decided, just for fun, to trip and slam my face into the back door step. Busting my lip in the most dramatic style, there was blood everywhere. Dad swept me up and ran a bath to wash away the gore so he could inspect the damage more clearly. I was plunged into the water, and he began to gently mop my blood-stained mug. This I took great offence to, and in protest decided it would be a good idea to nut the taps, using both my forehead and my eyebrows. The bath became a scarlet trough, and my tattered face now resembled that of Charles Lawton in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. I still have the scars. By the time Mum returned, I'd been thoroughly cleansed and sterilised, all my wounds swathed in lint and plaster. I looked like an American quilt. Of course, this wasn't my dad's fault, and Mum understood that. But for me, it was the beginning of a life of falling over things, and out of things, and off things. In fact, if I could go out of my way to stumble, plummet, or collide with anything, I would. Once, when I was 3 years old, I was playing on a patch of waste ground when I began to taunt a small terrier who proceeded to attack me, biting me on the hand. Again, I still have the scars. Another time I was playing at my friend John Baker's house when he amusingly decided to lock me in his toy trunk until I begged for mercy. When I got out, he hurled a piece of broken glass at me which cut my hand. Yet again, I still have the scars. Perhaps these not-so-tragic events have been a catalyst, but timidity, in varying degrees, has followed me throughout my years. Even now, I spring out of my chair if a squirrel leaps onto my face whilst I'm watching television. I react in much the same spineless way if a kraken rises from the depths, attacks my vessel, and hurls me into the maelstrom. Over the years, I've managed to control and quell this anxiety and transform it into a puffed-up boldness, combined with a psychological mindset that renders any brittleness invisible. If you're of a similar disposition, you might like to try the following methods yourself. For instance, should you have a worrisome work colleague who regularly attacks you with a mallet, stand your ground and stare at him, her, with crossed eyes and hum a single low note. Thus giving them the impression that you are rather otherworldly and mysterious, and should therefore be given a wide berth. I've employed this method on numerous occasions with almost total success. The only time it failed was when I was attacked by a Cockney barrow boy for the crime of being from the north, and was roundly thrashed whilst I stood humming at him with bug eyes. Happily, that traumatic event falls just outside this book's chronological remit. Other survival methods I can vouch for include the twist, where a dance is used as a distraction to foil your opponent. Any dance will do, but a casual, informal, and not too vigorous one will probably work the best. This technique can also be used to break the ice and make friends in tricky social situations, perhaps at a supermarket checkout or a clay pigeon shoot. Whilst other children who were being bullied at school would cower up against the walls pathetically uttering things like, "Not the face! My dad's a policeman," or "Do you want money?" with one leg partially raised, presumably as an involuntary movement to guard the genitals and so secure the survival of future timorous weaklings, I could be seen stood in the middle of a playing field, gently swaying to a non-existent beat, cock-eyed and droning, whilst bullies walked away from me, shaking their heads in confused despair. On the 11th of October 1962, Mum presented me with a sibling, Lois Elizabeth Moir. She took after my father, with dark hair and brown eyes, while I, with fair hair and blue eyes, resembled my mother. The other principal difference was that I was born in St. Jimmy's, whilst Lois was delivered in the coal shed. There was a mighty gale blowing, and Mum had gone outside to collect some fuel. She hauled open the door of the coal shed and entered, stooping to gather the tinder. At that moment, a potent gust raged through the garden, slamming the door shut and knocking her into the sooty pile. A blood-curdling cry rang out from within the coal chamber, alerting Dad, who was indoors at his repast. He rose from his plate, a look of confused apprehension on his face and a pork sausage dangling from his mouth. He looked like Winston Churchill with piles. Hurling his chair across the room, narrowly missing a visiting chaplain, he sped into the garden to find the source of the cry. Throwing the shed door open, he was confronted by the disturbing image of my mother's supine form blackened from thrashing about on the coals. "What is the meaning of this outburst?" he bellowed imperiously, the sausage still in its earlier position. "I was dining in the presence of a visiting chaplain when I heard a distant cry, one of anguish, even despair, and now I discover it is you, my wife, languishing upon the coal pile. Offer me an understanding of this confused scene, woman." "I'm in the throes of childbirth, husband. I fear the child comes. Make preparations instantly, there is no time to spare. Fetch hot water, lay down your cloak here on the damp coals, and prepare to deliver the infant forthwith, as I am in great and plain anxiety." Father drew the waters and laid down his cloak, and the child was born, a beautiful black-haired girl, safely delivered in the dark shelter. She was named right there upon the coals, Lois after our Alaskan aunt, and Elizabeth after our good Queen Bess. Of course, my parents didn't really speak in this absurd Milton-esque way, and my sister wasn't born in a coal shed. But that's the way I choose to imagine the scene, so let that be the end of it. She was born at home, though, in the larder. My mother's mother was Lillian Lee. She was married to Simeon Lee, who had died in 1949, being 30 years older than Lillian. It was later revealed that he'd married before, had 3 sons, and abandoned them all before bigamously marrying my grandmother. Their early life, and that of my mum, had been spent either moving around from village to village as my grandfather went in search of various dead-end jobs, or signed on the dole. This was odd, as he came from a well-to-do family of butlers and was always impeccably dressed in fine suits and spats with a fresh flower in his lapel. But when Simeon died, after belated complications due to the injuries he'd received when buried in a First World War trench, Grandma moved to Moortown in Leeds, a couple of miles from Adel. She lived there with my Auntie Ada, a woman of frightening appearance, black and grey hair cut into a short back and sides, thick, horn-rimmed glasses, and military-style garments. Ada believed that children should be regularly beaten with birches and cat-o'-nine-tails. My sister and I would cower when she entered the room and hide in the scullery until we were sure the coast was clear. She was the antithesis of our grandma, who's the sweetest woman in Yorkshire, and, by the way, Ada wasn't our real auntie, but Grandma's friend and companion. For trips further afield than Grandma's house, Dad drove our family around in a Bond minicar, a tiny three-wheeled chariot powered by a 125cc Villiers motorcycle engine, with the four of us wedged into it like sardines. Prior to this, and before we were born, Dad rode motorcycles, Norton's in particular. He and his friend Peter Scott often went to the TT races on the Isle of Man, as well as entering their own road races, and his love of bikes was echoed later by myself, as they were my first form of motorised transport, especially 50s and 60s British bikes, like the ones my dad had ridden. Anyway, the next step for a motorcyclist planning to move into covered transport was the three-wheeler, because you could drive them on a two-wheeler licence, hence the minicar. Every weekend we would travel around the countryside visiting castles, gardens and ascending hills and mountains from the North Yorkshire moors to the Lake District, trying to encourage the minicar up 1 in 4 gradients and around snaking mountain passes proved an anus-clenching experience. The vehicle regularly veering wildly off the road into tarns or sliding backwards down scree slopes. In icy conditions, we would desperately struggle up the hills, wheels spinning wildly, and a look of grim determination on Dad's face as he willed the thing along. In 1964, aged 5, I began primary school. The fire station where I was initially tutored was just a short walk from home. Huge, great red sliding doors opened into the spacious interior which was used to house the fire engines, and off to the right was the small room with high windows that was our classroom. Like most of the other children, I was petrified at leaving the homely warmth of what we had known in our tender years. Torn from our mothers' bosoms, we were thrust into an unknown arena to be lorded over by a new governess alongside children we didn't know. Who was this woman who had replaced our mothers, and why should we surrender to her authority? We screamed and kicked and launched our lunch at the walls, banana sandwiches and tea cakes stuck to every corner as we were abandoned by our equally distraught parents. But being subservient infants, we soon gave way to our new mistress and nervously settled into our new world. "Good morning, children. My name is Miss Wilson, and I am your teacher." "You're not my mum," screamed Hayley Dobson. "I want my doggy," yelped Brian Holthorpe. "Blah!" offered John Reynolds. I took a slightly different tack. "Belay there, shipmates," I pronounced forcefully. "Let's hear what our new captain has to say before we condemn her." The noise quickly abated, calm descended, and Miss Wilson once again addressed her crew. "Thank you, Roddy. Now, once again, I am Miss Wilson, and the first thing that we shall do today is try to write our names. Can we do that?" "Yes, miss," we sang, and were issued with scraps of sugar paper and wax crayons to scrawl with. Tongues out and hunched-backed, we set crayon to paper and began to make our marks, which were collected by Miss Wilson and scrutinized. We eagerly awaited the results as poor Miss Wilson attempted to decipher the hieroglyphics. "Hands up, Jug Potlda." No one responded. "Hands up, Harry Bed." Silence. "Ah, here's one. Roderick Moir." Victory was mine. Praise the Lord! Informal handwriting lessons held by Mum had earned me the prize of being the only child in the room able to declare themselves to be in a state of literacy. I puffed out my chest, stuck my hands on my hips, and held my chin in the air. I paraded around the classroom like Mussolini, looking down my nose at my failed peers. "I am the winner! I am the winner! You are all losers, 'cause I am the winner!" I chanted cockily until some whispered words and the guiding hand of Miss Wilson set me back in my chair. On collection from my first day at school, I excitedly told Mum of my triumph and was rewarded with an ice pop and a packet of Parma violets, and later, when Dad returned home, a dinky toy Austin 7. This seemed like it might work out all right. Tomorrow I would write my name again and receive more gifts. Sadly, that wasn't the way it worked, as the next day we had to count and write numbers on sugar paper. I was a dismal failure, and my earlier pride was replaced by the dunce's cap. Whilst I enjoyed my time at the fire station, it was to be short-lived. New technology meant that many jobs at the Yorkshire Post were in peril, and one of these was Dad's. He'd been offered another position at the Northern Echo as a linotype operator, working nights, typing the news and racing results on a giant black typewriter. I once saw him operate this monster, and his fingers sped across the keys like lightning. While I was at school, and unbeknownst to us, Dad had been on several exploratory trips to the area around Darlington, where the Northern Echo was based, searching for a new home for us. Pretty villages like Herworth and Barton were considered, but all proved too distant or expensive, and eventually one day he returned home with some news. We were having tea when he made his announcement. "Family, we will shortly be leaving this home, this city, and indeed this county, and remove ourselves to a distant land beyond the boundaries of our beloved Yorkshire. We shall travel far to a new realm, a province known locally as County Durham, the land of the Prince Bishops, the kingdom where Cuthbert found his final resting place. In short, pack your bags, we're off." A mixture of excitement and trepidation hung about the table like a pair of frillies dangling from a washing line. "What news is this, father?" I squealed. "How can this be when we are prosperous and flourishing? Our table is well laid, the house in good repair, and we are content." "Fear not, child," Mum asserted. "This land of which your father speaks holds great fortune for us. We shall valiantly tread this new soil with hearts of lions." And with those sage-like words ringing in my head, I retired to my room and began to pack my worldly possessions, my dinky toys, and my teddy. Our new home would be 59 Hewitson Road in Darlington, a 1950s semi-detached house on the outskirts of town. When we arrived, the Pickfords' removal lorry was waiting, filled with our furniture. The great thrill for me on entering was the fact that we had stairs, a novelty that I greatly abused by charging up and down them until my shoes were stripped of their soles. My bedroom was at the front of the house, and I settled in instantly, my dinky toys carelessly thrust beneath the bed in their box, and my teddy delicately hurled onto the bed. We were installed. Yet more change was coming. The next day, I would begin at my new school, Eastbourne Primary. In my first 5 years in Adel Road, I had developed a strong Leeds accent, though I was, of course, oblivious to this. As I settled into my position in the classroom on my first day, I was asked by my new teacher, Mrs. Harris, to declare myself, who I was, and what my intentions were. "My name is Roderick Moir," I proclaimed, as guffaws erupted in the room, "and I've just moved here from Leeds." The hilarity it caused among my fellow students was rich, and even Mrs. Harris was on the floor in a fetal position, desperately clutching her stomach in fits of laughter. Children were banging the tables and pulling out their hair, biting their satchels and ramming their rubbers into their mouths in order to staunch their hysterics. The headmaster, Mr. Cheeseman, came to investigate. "What is the meaning of this outburst?" he bellowed. "Say it again, Roderick," Mrs. Harris managed to gurgle through a veil of tears. I stood and once again made my bladder-rupturingly amusing claim to being of Yorkshire origin. Mr. Cheeseman collapsed beside Mrs. Harris and expelled a fart as he gasped for air. I had unwittingly presented my first gag, thinking, what the heck, if you can't beat him, join him. I too burst into gales of laughter. I quickly made friends at my new school, my best friend being Andrew Parler, a boy with hair that resembled an ice cream, a thick bush of luxurious woolly blonde curls that erupted from his crown to a height of approximately 6 inches. I was deeply jealous of this fleecy mop and would make informal requests to poke my finger deep into its pile, to mould and generally tease it into never-before-seen shapes. Andrew lived in the next street, Linton Gardens, in a house similar to ours. We played like any other boys in our 5-year-old ways, sending our toy cars plummeting to their doom over curbstones. On a daily basis, at least 300 major accidents occurred at our omnipotent hands. We were gods of destruction, but with a suitably supernatural power to revive both the passengers and the vehicles ready for the next day's destruction derby. Our toy cars could also fly, which meant that we could enjoy even more exciting crashes in the form of mid-air collisions. Our after-school hours were spent down there in the gutter and on the curb, orchestrating our disasters, until one day an older boy approached us. He was a slit-eyed lad of about 9, with a face the shape and colour of a pancake. "What you doing?" he asked in a voice that demanded a response. "Just playing?" we replied faintly, not looking up from our carnage. "I'm playing too," he proclaimed, and proceeded to produce an enormous ball bearing. Lots of kids' dads worked at factories and foundries in the area, and therefore their fathers would bring home these giant steel balls as the ultimate marble, to be used to crush all opponents in a game of alleys. These ball bearings were used in the manufacture of massive crankshafts for trains and earth shifters and weighed about 10 pounds, and this ball bearing was the king of them all. We gazed on through eyes filled with tears as the ruthless fiend pounded and pulverized our world into submission. Coupes, cabriolets, convertibles, and concept cars, all reduced to a formless pile of scrap. "There!" he laughed. "Now there's a pile-up!" And he sped off, giggling, in the direction of the Firthmoor estate, his gait a lopsided trot beneath the weight of his globe of destruction. We tenderly scooped up our devastated collection of twisted metal and vowed to destroy the pancake boy with fire, despite knowing that a trip to the Firthmoor estate was like a voyage into some terrifying jungle inhabited by wild and nameless creatures who would no doubt be hungry for our blood. Deciding against revenge, we went indoors for a kind word of sympathy from Andrew's mum and some lemon barley water. A few months later, I was once again round at Andrew Parler's house. This time we were seated at a small table covered with a lace tablecloth and piled high with soda cakes, Battenbergs, and fondant fancies, accompanied by the weakest of squashes. We were seated in front of the Parler's TV, the reason being that the event of the year, the funeral of Sir Winston Churchill, was being broadcast, and we had front-row seats. I recall this clearly, although I'm sure neither of us had the faintest idea who this bulky statesman was, and the solemnity of the occasion swept over us as we tucked into our tea. The Parler's front room had a kind of Edwardian sobriety, browns and creams battling with black-lined mahogany, only lightened by Andrew's glowing hair, much removed from the Moir household's bright and airy modernistic design for living. In our own sitting room, we now had a black and gold-flecked suite, offering not the slightest margin for comfort. This rested upon a mysterious gold and green Axminster, and the walls were a flavoursome burnt orange wood chip. I loved it. It was home, and it felt that way. In our house, we had an Echo television, a 10-inch screen nestling within a gold-sprayed plastic and mahogany surround with 2 dials for selecting your channel and then tuning in. The goggle box, as my dad called it, sat in the corner of the room and was used only occasionally and only for selective viewing. The telly was an amusement to be considered when conversation had dried up or a monarch had perished. But things began to change in the mid-60s. Conversations in the workplace and in schoolyards started to revolve more and more around soap opera characters and less around real lives. We were entering a new voyeuristic fictional age, and to maintain your place in society, you had to be aware of Ina Sharple's port and lemon consumption or Ken Barlow's erratic love life, and so the television slowly began to take centre stage. Armchairs were slowly eased round to face the screen, coffee tables were angled parallel to the tragic lantern, but not in our house. The fireplace remained the family focal point, and viewing was restricted to my programme, unless a formal written application was made requesting the viewing of a second programme, which went before the committee, Mum and Dad, for clearance. My programme was Andy Pandy. The sailor-suited and bonneted boy puppet would emerge from his housing, a wooden toy box, along with his mistress, Slooby Loo, and assorted other living toys, in order to plot the downfall of his master. Andy's master was a boy called Danny, or Tommy, or something like that, who seemed completely unaware that whilst he was absent, his toy puppets would rise from their sanctums and gather around the prophet Andy and listen to his ramblings on life as a downtrodden marionette and how he could help them flee this penal institution. I later graduated to become an avid viewer of Supercar, Jerry Anderson's super tale of a scientific family with a comical pet monkey named Mitch, and their adventures in the supercar that they had invented. This was followed by Fireball XL5, all about a space rocket piloted by the heroic Steve Zodiac, and The Magnificent Stingray, featuring the submarine masterfully skippered by Troy Tempest, his co-pilot Phones, and love interest Marina, a mute aquatic beauty who, in response to Troy's amorous approaches, looked astoundingly vacuous and ignorant. Troy's arch-enemy was Titan, the evil Neptunesque leader of a giant undersea nation of aquamen, hell-bent on thwarting any land-dweller's trips beneath the waves and into their realm. I loved this series, and would impress school friends with impressions of the heroes, including comical scenes between smarmy Troy and the exaggeratedly vapid Marina, which were applauded by my peers because nobody liked her. She was a girl who simply got in the way of the macho men's undersea work. I suspect Jerry Anderson was under pressure from his wife and Puppet Empire partner Sylvia to attempt to lure girls into this boy-dominated world. There could have been no other explanation for the truly laughable credit sequence featuring Troy singing a love ballad to a gormless-looking Marina who appeared to have the DTs and wobbled uncontrollably throughout this crooning. Every few weekends, we would visit Dad's parents, Nana and Grampy. I loved these trips. We would drive over the beautiful North Yorkshire moors to Seamer, near Scarborough, where they lived in a bungalow on a quiet road opposite a sheep field. As we arrived at their home and emerged from the car, the air was filled with the savoury scent of mince and onions. This, accompanied by mashed potato, was the staple meal on our visits, and it was mine and Lois's favourites, and always seemed to herald the onset of a good weekend. Nana was a sweet and kindly old lady, with the whitest hair in the land and, to me, strange arthritic hands. She had an oddly pleasant smell about her, a mixture of marzipan and carbolic soap, and was also a terrific wit. Some years later, when she was near her end, she was living at my Auntie Ray's house. She spent her day sitting on a chair with a blanket over her knees and rarely saying anything. One day, when we were watching the news, Uganda's President Idi Amin was coming to London to visit the Queen. Nana, after what must have been days of silence, piped up, "Well, I hope he's brought his sandwiches with him." I howled with laughter. Her comic timing was impeccable. Grampy was a glorious eccentric, a powerful patriarch and devilishly funny. He was also a great educationalist. When we arrived at their home, I was always summoned to his study for an interview. He would make inquiries as to my progress at school and then produce his ancient dictionary, a huge leather-bound lexicon that he had used when he was a boy. I was urged to open it at a random page and, eyes closed, blindly place my finger somewhere on the page, then open my eyes and see what word my finger had landed upon. I was then asked to read the description out loud, and the next visit would have to use the previous visit's word in a sentence. There were happy days at Nana and Grampy's. We used to spend our summer holidays there with our Auntie Ray and Uncle Norman and our cousins Tim, Barbie and Pam, renting chalets on the front at Scarborough. The hours would pass quickly, and I would spend them rolling around on the sand with my cousin Tim, writing bizarre poetry, playing dominoes with Grampy, and going to watch the model ship battles at dusk at Peasholm Park. Grampy was always a bit of a small-time gambler, occasionally on the horses, but mainly the slot machines at Jimmy Corrigan's arcades. I would accompany him on these gambling excursions, and he would impart such worldly wisdom as, "Always drink your beer from a mug with a handle, otherwise you'll turn into a woman," and "Never leave the house without a monogrammed handkerchief," and "Always keep a chamber pot beneath your bed." He had a gazunder beneath his bed at home, and I was offered a glance at its contents each morning. We would return to the chalet after a trip to the arcades, coins jangling in our pockets, to be greeted with the happy scene of our united family. Grampy was also incurably addicted to the adverts for newfangled rubbish in the back of newspapers. He was forever sending off for electric boiled egg slicers or devices for turning the pages of a book without using your hands. Pointless stuff, but he couldn't resist it. On one of our summer holidays at the chalet, he brought along a metal detector. The children were to take turns at sweeping the beach with his new toy, searching for coins that unlucky bathers had dropped, while he observed our progress from the roof of the chalet with a pair of World War II binoculars, presumably removed from the hands of a U-boat captain just before he sank beneath the waves. We would return each evening with our hoard and deposit it into a makeshift receptacle so it could be counted and stashed away. One day, Grampy came up with another money-making scam. This one involved me wearing a sheet and a towel wrapped round my head. I was told to walk up and down the chalets, clutching a small tin bowl and saying that I was a poor Arab boy in dire need of money for food. This I duly did, and thoroughly enjoyed it, especially when I returned home with my pot brimming. And there was the same feeling of satisfaction when the holidays came to an end and we packed up and split off in our various directions, heavy with happy memories and threepenny bits. I was making new friends in the area, and one of these was a boy who lived directly opposite us. Our meeting, however, was slightly out of the ordinary. I would look out of my bedroom window onto the street and occasionally be distracted by some curious and often baffling movements in the bedroom opposite. It was a boy of about my own age, twisting and gyrating and striking highly unusual poses on his bed. Even more disturbing was the fact that he occasionally glanced in my direction. In fact, it often seemed as if he was doing it for my own benefit. Was it simply that he was practicing his evening calisthenics, or was it some kind of primitive semaphore? I decided upon the latter and replied to his poses with equally queer stances of my own. These nightly exchanges became a regular occupation for us, and after a period we signalled that perhaps we should meet, presumably to discuss the merits of our unusual language of gesture. And so it was that we eventually came face to face on neutral ground in the middle of the street. My new friend was indeed a strange boy, as I believed he must have thought me. His name was Peter Collins, and he was a Titian-haired son of a farmer whose luxuriant freckles suggested that he had been following a muck-spreader for miles. We never discussed our semaphore sessions. Perhaps there was no need. It was just a naive and childlike way of making a connection. If this means of communication was practiced by adults, say, for instance, my father to Peter's father, then not only eyebrows, but also questions would have been raised. Peter Collins suggested that I might like to take a look in his dad's garage, as he had something there that I might be interested in. I followed him into the dimly lit outbuilding. There was a faint smell of sawdust and rotting meat. "Look there," he whispered, and perched on a shelf, filled with spanners and grips, was a large black crow, beady-eyed and staring right back at us. It was his pet. "Wow!" I quietly squealed. "Will it attack us?" "Only if I give the command," he replied, with enough authority to make me back away in the direction of the door. "I've got eggs as well," he announced, and showed me a shoebox filled with sawdust and small, blown eggs, robins, blackbirds, pheasants, and even a cuckoo's. This is, of course, illegal nowadays, but in the 1960s, a lot of boys had egg collections in the bottom drawers of their bedroom chest, and I soon became one of them. There were moral rules to our egg theft, insomuch as we would only remove one egg from a nest, and if there was only one egg, then it must remain there. I became obsessive. Wherever I went, I would be peering into hedgerows for nests, climbing trees, and looking into hollows. I became an expert bird watcher and observer of signs and evidence of their nesting sites. Eventually, other boys would come to me for information and guidance. I became the Sherpa Tenzing of Darlington's outlying fields, the Tonto of adjoining woodland, the chief eggman. But I never had a pet crow. My consistent requests for a pet crow were firmly rejected as rank folly, although there was an alternative proposed, which necessitated a visit to my Auntie Elsie and Uncle Bert in Leeds. Auntie Elsie had been a publican, along with her first husband, Jack. They ran the Globe public house in Meanwood Road. Sadly, Jack had had a heart attack and died at Mum and Dad's wedding, and so Auntie Elsie sold up and moved to a small flat in Cardigan Road. Soon after, she met Bert, a short, jovial man who was also widowed. They married and became what appeared to me to be the happiest people in Leeds. Their flat was an opulent Victorian affair with rich pub-style furnishings and a framed poster of a scene from Swan Lake above the fireplace. On entering their portals, Lois and I were always invited to delve into Auntie Elsie's handbag in order to retrieve some long-lost pre-war sweeties. The reason we were there on this occasion was to collect Joey, a budgie that had lived at the Globe with Elsie and Jack and had now outgrown its usefulness. Joey was a standard bird of its type, green and blue, prone to twittering and eager to fly about the room on being released from its regular-sized cage. Nothing out of the ordinary with this feathered friend, even its name. After all, 99% of budgies in Britain are named Joey. Joey definitely wasn't anything like as exciting as a crow, and even though it would perch on my shoulder, I doubted it would have raised my status in the cool ranks if I were to be spotted pelting down the street on my bike with a budgie in tow. I was nonetheless grateful, and Joey joined our family, occupying a special position by the back window. I loved to watch her, or him, we never did identify the bird's sex, flit about the room on missions to find the highest points available for landing, and with her incessant chirping and occasional packages of bird poo deposited without fail onto a crumpet or an occasional direct hit right in a cup of tea, she was the Bomber Harris of the bird world. Joey lived with us for 4 years and became a much-loved friend. One day, I was out shopping with Mum, and on returning home, there was a solemn atmosphere hanging about the home. Dad sat us down and announced in a grave tone, "I've got some distressing news. The bird Joey has perished. She fell from her perch at approximately 10:15 a.m. GMT, and I have swaddled her in toilet paper in preparation for immediate burial." It was the first time anything had died in my world. Prior to that, I just assumed everything lived forever. Nevertheless, I came to terms with the loss, and we buried Joey in the garden beneath a wooden gravestone with Joey inscribed on it in biro. A few pertinent words were said, Dad being the orator, and we retired to the house for a solemn tea. We were dealt another blow the following day, when Dad made a further announcement that Joey had been exhumed and devoured by next door's grave-robbing cat. I fumed and promised that I would have my revenge on this feline Burke and Hare. I never did, but soon after, to alleviate the trauma, Dad returned home with a replacement budgie, similar in every respect to our dearly departed Joey. We installed the new bird into her cage and sat down to think of a name for it, eventually deciding, originally enough, on Joey. But was the new Joey as clever as the old one? Could she fly to the outer reaches of the sitting room and return to her cage without prompting? Could she accurately bomb our tea? It was time to find out. The cage door was opened, and out she flew, twice round the room and out of the window. She had been in our company less than an hour, and she was gone. But the saga didn't end there. 7 years later, Mum visited our neighbours, the Websters, and noticed that they had a budgie. "We had one like that some years ago," she said. "Oh, Joey," replied Mrs. Webster. "She flew in through our window 7 years ago to this very day." Yes, it was our Joey, the escapee. Mum immediately grabbed the startled bird and barricaded herself in the house, pursued by a confused and irate Webster family. No, she didn't. She just returned home with the dramatic news and left it at that. Pets were never really a feature in our house, although I did manage to persuade my parents to allow me a small catfish that I roguishly named Hitler. But sadly, he didn't last long. Hitler was discovered floating upside down one morning, presumably after his bowl had been invaded by Russians and Americans during the night, and he had taken the cyanide tablet that he had secreted beneath his ceramic Davy Jones locker. I also kept a sand lizard that I flushed out from beneath a parked Ford Zodiac on my way home from school. I housed it in a shoebox and cleverly named it Sandy. But soon after it died, both of boredom and of the shame of being a sand lizard named Sandy. In the 1960s, Darlington was a stronghold for gypsies, and their encampments were visible all round the outskirts of town, as was their presence within the town itself. The sound of horse and cart clip-clopping along through the streets was a regular event. Generally, the cart was piloted by two gypsies on a mission to relieve people of household scrap, mangles that had ceased to mangle, rabbit hutches whose occupants had been murdered in the recent spate of rabbit killings that we'd been enduring, bicycles whose whistling owners had driven them into trees on their way back from a post-work gallon in the wheat sheaf, and armchairs whose springs had sprung through the seats and begun to penetrate the buttocks of the sitter. These objects were gathered and taken to their campsites, where they were piled up and left to mature for a couple of years. Another equine-powered visitor who made house calls was Mr. Todd, a travelling vegetable man whose covered wagon was laden with all manner of garden produce. Mr. Todd was a sullen-faced individual who wore a Trilby hat that was far too small for him. I can only presume that it was glued on to stop it from blowing off. His arrival on the street was greeted by children gathering around and begging their mothers to buy carrots to feed Mr. Todd's horse, Eric. This was a great ploy by Mr. Todd, as he never had to pay for food for Eric. We paid for it, or at least our mothers did. We would queue up and take turns at feeding the obese cob until the women had got their supplies. Then Eric would produce a rousing fart, present us with a mountain of steaming manure, and trundle off to the next group of carrot-wielding kids. After the cart was gone, men would appear with shovels and fight each other over the prize-winning dung deposits laid along the street. One of the other boys who would join me in feeding the ravenous Eric was a big curly-haired lad called Stephen Hodgson, or Hodgie, and he became my new best friend. Hodgie lived at 22 Hewitson Road, and we would spend our time together doing the usual things like trying to fish things out of drains, attaching playing cards to the spokes of our bike wheels so they sounded vaguely like motorcycles, and, of course, bird nesting. Most people had a black-and-white television, but Hodgie announced one day that his mum and dad had got a colour TV. We went round to see this marvel of modern times and were offered a demonstration. It wasn't exactly what I was expecting. It was just their old black-and-white telly with a piece of coloured transparent film ranging from red at the top through yellow in the middle and down to blue at the bottom, sellotaped to the screen. The effect was, as you would expect, if watching a western of a red sky with yellow horses galloping across what appeared to be the sea. Still, you couldn't deny it was colour, and we watched it for hours and hours until the television heated up and the cellophane buckled, distorting the images to the point that we were looking at primary coloured newsreaders who appeared to have been plunged into a vat of acid, and westerns that had more in common with Timothy Leary than Sergio Leone. Hodgie and I developed an exciting pastime of trying to throw objects and get them caught on power lines in the hope of seeing them set alight or explode when a charge went through them. Our favourite objects to ensnare on the cables were action men, and we would spend hours trying to get them to snag on the wires. One day, Hodgie had a brilliant idea. We will go and find a stick and a bit of string and tie them onto the action man. That will make it easier to catch it over the wire. You go and search in that direction, and I'll look over there, and if you find a stick or a piece of string, let out a shrill call. That did it for me. Let out a shrill call. I fell down laughing. A shrill call? I thought it was hilarious, and rolled around in fits on the floor for what seemed like days. When I eventually did stop howling, Hodgie was gone.